Hi, everyone. I'm Associate Professor Martin Lemel, the Director of Research at TD School. TD stands for Transdisciplinary, where we connect the dots between the disciplines to make innovation happen. And today's module, or this module, is about accelerators. Before we talk about accelerators, you need to think about what kind of startup are you? Are accelerators even really the right thing for you? I mean, the subtitle for this here isn't just accelerators. At the very top, you'll see it's other forms of institutional support. So we'll get to what accelerators are in a second. But first, and cover some other forms of support, but I also want you to think about what kind of entrepreneur are you? What kind of startup are you? Is it just you and you're a sole proprietor? Are you doing a service-based startup or just a company? Are you a small to medium enterprise? Or are you really going for something that's tremendously scalable at a rapid pace? So these questions will come through in a moment. And different startups will need different funding structures and different levels of support as well. So for context, part of these slides are based on the research we did to help establish the federal Incubator support program. So if you'd like more information about that, one of the slides has a link to the report that we did where a lot of this data came from and the research came from. So just letting you know that what we see here actually matters and is accepted at the federal level too. So what kind of startup you are also affects what kind of funding or what kind of support you want. So in terms of what founders want, what we find in the research is that founders don't just want the money. The money is kind of like, as it had explained it to me once during my MBA, like the money to a business is like the air to a human being. You kind of need it to survive. More of it is generally better. But you should focus on why you exist first. But in terms of why to look for an accelerator or what other common resources there are that founders look for, funding is definitely a huge one of them. Another one's legitimacy, actually, that people take you seriously. If you're just a young company, how does another company or organization, whether an organization you're partnering with or even a customer, really think of you as a legitimate company? So that's often by association. What kind of training or business development support might you need? And what kind of feedback are you looking for? The feedback varies a bit between whether you're getting feedback from mentors, from your direct peers like other entrepreneurs, or feedback from the customers in the market. And also generally, what kind of environment are you in that supports innovation and entrepreneurship? So that was roughly in the ranking of what founders think they want. Now, after founders go through an accelerator program, here's what they say they value. So yes, the funding does matter. You do need the financing to build the business, not just to sell the product, but to build the business, to hire people before you can sell enough product or service in order to support their income. But legitimacy was another big one. And the next biggest ones were around mentoring and peers. So putting yourself in that environment where you're surrounded by other like-minded individuals who might have faced the same challenges you have, and mentors who have been there before, walked that mile in your shoes, and now know how to support you. So keep those in mind. Now, what accelerators are, because that's the core topic of this here, and I'll give you a breakdown of each of the elements in a minute, is there are two definitions. One is that they are that they provide seed funding. That's kind of one of the core elements. The other one is that there's a cohort effect. So that means there's a competitive entry. You have to actually apply to get in. Not everyone gets in. Sometimes only the top 10 are selected. Everyone starts at the same time, learns and develops together. It assumes everyone's at the same stage, which doesn't always work. And everyone ends at the end. And that's usually through like a major graduation ceremony or a demo day where people go on stage and present the work that they've got to the broader community and to the next round of investors. And so that sometimes that alone is a bit of a recruiting event for the next cohort too. Then the emphasis is on teams. So accelerator suggests you've already got something that needs to be accelerated. So you're not totally starting from scratch. So you need a team with a prototype or something already that can be accelerated. The definition we're focusing on here is around co-location too. So the team focus kind of comes out through the rest of the variables, but we're actually pulling out the co-location factor as well too, that to create that environment, we're surrounded by peers and you have an event space where you can rub shoulders with other people who show up to events. Co-location can be very, very important to create that, to facilitate that peer learning environment. Then there's the structured program, and this varies quite a bit from one accelerator to another, or one program to another. So this is a lot like the coursework you might experience at university. Some of it is very structured textbook coursework stuff, but a lot of accelerators have backed off of that, saying, yeah, there is the coursework textbook stuff, but we want to really figure out what business development every startup needs that's unique to that startup. So they might standardize some things based on the sector that they're targeting, but then otherwise they focus very much on bespoke support, and that's often through the last variable, mentoring, that they find mentors who are specific to your sector, to your stage of development, to your customer, to your supply chain, everything. Okay, so in terms of funding, we got a couple of graphics here, I'll just back off. So in terms of funding, there are different levels of funding. So venture capital probably gets the most media attention. However, very, very few companies actually need venture capital. It's not the best fuel for a company to grow on. It works only for a particular stage where you actually have something that's scalable and is ready to scale at the same time that the venture capital funds have that money available for them in the sector they're interested in. You've got the connections they're interested in. But many times, companies can grow quite well off their own revenues as well too. So that's a highly underrated source of growth. To get to venture capital, yes, you need seed grant funding, otherwise known as angel investing. That will often put you on the treadmill of expecting investor after investor to put money into your business to help grow the business, to then get their money back out, either through an acquisition or through an initial public offering on the public markets. Then before seed capital, a lot of founders put their own money in. So then there's the 3F, friends, fools, and family, but I'll add founders in there too, because that's personal money. That's relatively, I wouldn't say easy to come by, but you have your friends, you have your family, you have your own funding. It's kind of a known entity. What's less known is grants. I often see some students say, I've got the great idea, I'll just get this public funding to a grant to do this, pull off this great idea. That might start something, but it's not a recurring revenue source or a recurring source of funding to grow your business over time. So they're good, but I wouldn't rely on them for growth. Same with debt too. It's kind of do it once or twice, but don't use it as a longer term plan for growing your company. So that's funding. In terms of mentoring, that can vary quite a bit. It can vary from something very formal, where we actually have a mentorship agreement with the person who's mentoring you, or it could be ad hoc. The person who's mentoring you might not even think of themselves as a mentor. They might meet you on an occasional basis, just happy to catch up over coffee and give back to the community, to give back to the next generation of entrepreneurs. Then another common source of mentorship is simply through your board of directors or board of advisors. So you might actually want to get to know people, their industry experience, their knowledge of your market and your product, everything, as a mentor before inviting them to formally join a board of advisors. The board of directors, usually they're also invested in the company as well. Next is the space. So the physical space you're in. Co-working spaces are to some extent first or maybe second generation incubators. But there's a little bit of a distinction between incubators and co-working spaces. Co-working spaces are often just that. They're physical space. They give you that legitimacy to say, look, I'm actually operating out of this space. You've got a physical mailbox, and people can know where to find you, know where to meet you. So you're not operating in your basement or out of your garage. Cool as it is, it doesn't have the same legitimacy as actually showing you're committed to pay the rent or hire a desk at a co-working space. It also puts you in that peer environment where you're learning alongside other people who are usually at the same stage of development you're in. And if you choose the co-working space, they're often in the same sector you're in. So there's some good peer learning opportunities. And even though somebody might be in the same sector, chances are you're not competing directly. So you can learn quite a bit from each other. Then co-working spaces are a bit like first and second generation incubators. First generation incubators were just cheap rent, helping you survive and not die, not necessarily grow. Second generation incubators started helping entrepreneurs grow. Third generation is even a bit more so. Third generation incubators actually can provide seed funding, and they usually do this on an ad hoc basis. So some of their tenants they might not support, some of them they would, but they'd have to negotiate each deal separately. it's still kind of first in, first served. If there's an open desk, if they want to have you, if you meet some criteria, then you can get in. So it's not the cohort model you see with accelerators. We'll get to that in a second. Then there's a question of who your peers are. Are you actually in an environment with your peers? Or are some of the peers just so far ahead and you happen to be, the lone entrepreneur who's just at the startup phase? So without that cohort effect, there's not that same normalization of people who are at the relatively the same stage. It's still very much a supportive environment. There's a lot of support for the entrepreneurs, largely through the in-house mentors, so the internal business development people. Because they, especially if they're taking equity in your business through seed funding, they've got a vested interest in making sure that you grow and succeed and survive. And in a way, they're pegging their reputation on yours. Then we get to pre-accelerators, getting closer and closer to accelerators here. So these are like like coursework, right? So this is where you don't necessarily have to have the physical co-location, but it certainly helps. There's no funding involved, but there's definitely that cohort effect where you're joining along with other people. There might have been a competitive process to get in. And as you're learning together, they're kind of stage gates, they're similar concepts. You can check with each other to say, hey, did you understand that concept the same way I would? How do you understand that? But it's largely about that program, or maybe the graduation afterwards. Some of this could be done physically, some of it could be done asynchronously online through MOOCs and that stuff too. So you'll see a lot of these different things, the mentoring, the funding, the co-location, the coursework. Many entrepreneurs actually do this themselves. They kind of piece together their support environment on their own. Where accelerators come in is they provide kind of a one-stop shop where you can just, if you get in, you can forget about trying to cobble together your own support environment. They just hand it to you. So they give you the seed funding, usually standardized. Everyone gets the same deal, so there's no debate about who got a better deal or not. There's that cohort effect. So everyone starts at the same time, everyone ends at the same time, but you're learning together as well. So there's a lot of learning within the team, across teams, and then from the mentors and the program. The program can vary quite a bit, whether it's how highly structured it is, and the mentoring is often very, very curated. So from your perspective, this is often what the entrepreneurs see. It is, the entrepreneur starts here, you go through a recruiting cycle, there's a selection committee within the incubator accelerator. Many of the people on the selection committee are the mentors. The mentors, then you'd want to then mentor the companies through the incubator accelerator. Then there's a lot of the structured workshops, professional facilitation. A large part of what they'll do is they'll push you out as well. So it's not just about hanging out with other incubators, other incubatees or other startups, but they will push you out to see what progress you're making and talking to the customer, to suppliers, to partners, investors. If you can get your next round of capital while you're still in the incubator or in the accelerator, even better than having to wait to the end. Like they'll push you for that progress. And so you go through these regular progress checks with the mentors and coaches and with the incubator accelerator operators. What you want to keep in mind though is, so this is what it looks like the first pass through. What you want to recognize though is that you're actually part of a larger system. And I'm getting a little bit ahead to the next slide of what to look for in an accelerator is you want to look at who the mentors are. Some of them might be the alumni coming out of the end of the program. You want to look at who the investors are. Look at what the co-location space is. Sometimes that physical address matters and the layout of the space and how often people show up. And look at those feedback loops. And particularly, another way to look at it is the alumni. So how good are the alumni coming out and what sort of follow-on funding have they received? So each of those plays a huge role in how incubators and accelerators work and also how to evaluate them. So as you're considering joining an accelerator, and you don't have to, because you can piece together a co-working space, you can look for your own funding, maybe be revenue funded. You can find your own peer environment, your own mentoring. But if you do want that one-stop shop for accelerators, you can look at whether they're in the right sector for you. So if you're in hardware, you don't necessarily need to apply for a software or biotech accelerator. It's not worth your time applying. You want to look at who the mentors are, what their experience is, whether they're 10 years ahead and whether they can still relate to the startup phase or whether they're actually close to the startup phase, like recent alumni. You want to look at the level of funding. Most accelerators have a pretty similar deal in terms of how much money they give you and how much equity they take. Might want to look at the location. Some require you to move, other ones are okay with a virtual team. Get some information on the program structure and whether you actually have to adhere to it. They might say, okay, here's the program. If any of it's new to you, definitely take it. If you're already familiar with some of these concepts, don't bother, but don't invest too much time, but come meet the other people in the cohort. And the other obvious hallmark for success is prior success. So where do you find out about accelerators? It turns out a lot of lists are really hard to maintain. The accelerator industry has a bit of a churn. Accelerators themselves are startups, or many of them are. Some have been around for 10 years and some only for 2 or 3. So it's actually hard to find a list that stands the test of time. One of the most recent really good ones is by Charles Mack, and the URL for it is right here. So hopefully by now you have a pretty good idea of what accelerators are, but also what other forms of support are. If you disaggregate the accelerator from its one-stop shop into different bits and pieces to figure out what's right for you. And lastly, I'll also add that when we were studying accelerators, when we tracked up to about 200 of them, at least a third of them were university affiliated. So think twice about what that university affiliation means, if it can mean access to labs or things like the protospace and the 3D printing, or whether you want something that's a bit more independent. And so the independence sometimes signals more legitimacy to future investors, but sometimes you want the access to the resources, including graduate students as amazing hires. So that's it for me. I hope you've learned something about accelerators, and I look forward to seeing you in another module.